Think about a choice you had to make. It might be a big life choice, something about your career, family, children. It might be something more mundane, like, what should I have for dinner? Did you make the right choice? The right choice. As human beings, we tend to frame our choices as right versus wrong. My goal today is to suggest that perhaps that way of thinking about our choices may be somewhat limiting, and to offer an alternative that might enable our creativity, sustain our curiosity, and if I may be so bold, might even enable us to change the world. You see, I can remember some of the bigger choices that I had to make in my life. After I graduated college, I was working as a consultant and debating whether I should go back to get a Ph.D. Did I want to help organizations as a consultant, or did I want to study them as an academic? And I remember in my Ph.D. debating my dissertation topic. Did I want to go with more well-established theories, or more peripheral, fringe, and perhaps even risky ones? And I certainly remember debating with my husband when we were going to have our children. Was I more family-oriented or career-oriented? You see, I study organizations, and their leaders face these kinds of tensions all the time. Am I an organization that's more focused on a breadth of products or depth of a certain number of products? Do I focus globally, or do I focus on local needs? Do I want to create an organization that's more focused on teamwork and collaboration, or more focused on individual achievement and perhaps competition? These are the kind of choices that enable our organizations to be identified. These are the kind of choices, however, that leave our leaders with some sleepless nights. And so in management, we teach our leaders how to make these decisions. First, we teach them how to make the right decision, or at least a better decision under the circumstances. Increasingly, economists and psychologists are coming together to identify the biases that we have in our decision making, and to encourage us to think about our decisions without such biases. And once we make the right decision, then we encourage our leaders to stick with those decisions, to be consistent. We like leaders that are steadfast and resolute. We don't like leaders that are flip-floppers. It may be that such decision-making, making the right decision and making better decisions, and then sticking with them and being consistent, is really beneficial. But it also might be limiting. You see, what this decision-making assumes is that in the face of such decisions, we have an either-or choice. We have to pick one or the other. What it misses is the possibility that we can embrace, engage, accept both sides simultaneously. That we can attend to a both-and thinking, what I would call a paradoxical approach. What is paradox? Paradoxes are ideas or elements that might seem completely rational, independent of one another, but contradictory, even perhaps absurd, when juxtaposed. Good and evil, right and wrong, in motion and at rest. And a paradoxical approach is actively bringing together those opposing ideas to be able to come up with new, creative ideas. So how do we actually move forward in the face of such uncertainty if we're not making a choice? My colleagues Marianne Lewis and Lotte Lusher talk about approaching paradox by creating workable certainties. And Marianne and I define two ways to think about workable certainties. First is a creative integration between two opposing ideas. If we think about the yin-yang, where each sliver is opposing thoughts, creative integration might be represented by the circumference around the circle. Psychiatrist Albert Rothenberg wanted to study geniuses. And what he found in understanding how geniuses think is that their breakthrough ideas emerged from bringing together competing ideas simultaneously. So Einstein discovered the theory of relativity by thinking about how an object could be both in motion and at rest simultaneously. And Mozart introduced new harmonies to us by thinking about discordance. And Picasso's art forms came from the juxtaposition of light and dark. Einstein, Picasso, Mozart, these were paradoxical thinkers. And yet not all competing demands can result in some new creative synthesis. And so the alternative is to be what we call consistently inconsistent, to fluidly shift between the alternative options. If you think about the yin-yang, it might be the line that demarcates the two opposing slivers. In one of my first research projects, I studied top management teams of IBM's strategic business units. These teams were tasked with being their market leaders in their existing product, but simultaneously developing new innovations that could potentially kill the existing product in the marketplace. And so they had to be operationally efficient while also being experimental. They had to exploit their existing certainties, their existing knowledge, their existing resources, while exploring new possibilities. What I found was that these teams, the ones that were truly excellent, weren't coming up with some new synthesis between today and tomorrow. They were the ones that were willing to be open to consistently shifting their resources, their attention, their time between their existing product and their innovation. They were dynamic. They were inconsistent. They were consistently inconsistent. A good example of paradoxical thinking is the booming social enterprise industries. Social enterprises are organizations that seek to make a difference in the world, to change the world, but through a business purpose. They actively embed a social mission with a financial purpose. It's not that our organizations haven't always had to deal with both the social and the financial. They have. But for the most part, we ask our organizations to make a choice between the two. Essentially, do you do good, or do you make a profit? And we reinforce this through our legal codes. Are you a for-profit or a not-for-profit? Which probably won out in its titles than are you a do-good organization and a don't-do-good organization? But this was the kind of choice that faced hippies Ben and Jerry in the late 1970s when they asked, why can't a for-profit ice cream company also do good? And this was the kind of choice that faced Muhammad Yunus, who's credited as being the father, the founder of microfinance, when he asked, why can't a developmental aid organization also be financially sustainable? And this was the kind of choice that faced social entrepreneur Jeremy Hockenstein over 10 years ago when he developed the organization Digital Divide Data, or DDD. DDD seeks to break the cycle of poverty in impoverished areas like Cambodia, Laos, Kenya, but they do so as a commercial business. They provide labor-intensive IT services. Essentially, they digitize old archival library materials and business content so that it's available online. But they do so by hiring some of the most disadvantaged people in their countries, people who are poor, who might have limited education, who might be physically disabled. And by providing them with the experience and the learning on the job, they help them to raise their socioeconomic status. DDD's had over 700 employees, with over 400 people that have graduated from this employment to go on and make approximately 4 times the regional average. I've been studying DDD since their founding, and I remember early on asking Jeremy, their CEO, a question that I am sure he's been asked a million times since. What are you? Are you a for-profit or are you a not-for-profit? Essentially, do you focus on doing good or do you focus on making money? And he answered me and said, we do both. It's not that doing both isn't challenging for them. It is. They have to face a number of questions in trying to manage both their social mission and their business purpose. Who should we hire? Do we hire the most disadvantaged that require extensive amount of training in order to be productive? Or do we hire for productivity? Do we put more of our resources into our social mission or into our business needs? How do we identify ourselves to our stakeholders. And yet they would also argue that by focusing on both the social and the financial, it makes them a more robust, more effective organization. You see, by having actual deliverables with actual clients, their employees can learn more, can gain more experience than if they were doing a not-for-profit training program. And even as they compete in the marketplace on price and quality, they find that they can still gain clients sometimes based on their social mission. So if paradoxical thinking can enable creativity, can sustain our curiosity, and may even be able to change our world, why don't we do more of it? I want to suggest 3 possible obstacles that stand in the way. The first is our epistemological beliefs about truth. We tend to follow an Aristotelian rational logic that suggests that there is a truth in the world with a capital T, and that our job is to go out and discover that truth. So in the face of competing demands, we have to choose which one is right and which one is wrong. And yet we know that even in our most rational fields, physics, mathematics, that truths are transient, and that sometimes there's multiple truths. We used to believe in a truth that the world was flat, and now we know differently. And our scientists will say that our world, at its most minuscule level of the quark, can only be described as at motion and at rest simultaneously. What would it look like if we believed in multiple possible truths? The second obstacle is our idea of resources being scarce. Underlying most of our decisions is a question of allocating resources, time, money, space. And we tend to adopt an economist view of these resources as scarce, zero-sum game. The more that I give away, the less that I have. But what if we were to change our thinking, to think about our resources as abundant, a positive-sum game? The more that I give away, the more that I have. This kind of abundance thinking is what underlies Google's notion of 20% time. Google offers its employees 20% of their time, about 1 day a week, to work on whatever they're passionate about. And they don't think about this time as losing 20% productivity. Instead, they think about it as gaining much more in terms of their innovation, creativity, employee engagement, and commitment. Economist Jeremy Rifkin noted that the greatest leaps in history have always been accompanied by changing our thinking about time and space. What if we were to think about time, space as abundant rather than as scarce? And the third obstacle I would suggest is our emotional need for stability. Facing competing demands is destabilizing. It leaves us uncertain. It leaves us anxious. And so we struggle to try and recapture the security of what once was by making a choice. But what if we were open to being vulnerable to the possibility of competing demands simultaneously? Albert Einstein wrote in his biography that when the principles of relativity began to emerge, he felt like the ground was pulled from under him and he had no firm foundation. What if we were to allow ourselves that kind of vulnerability? You see, we all face competing demands. In our personal lives, in our professional worlds, leaders face these kinds of competing demands in their organization all the time. What would it look like to adopt more paradoxical thinking in these kinds of choices? I would suggest that first, we have to reframe our thinking from an either-or thinking to a both-and thinking. And then we might have to rethink our beliefs about truth, our beliefs about scarcity, our beliefs about stability. Paradoxes are not new. These are ideas embedded in our ancient religions. Eastern religions talk about the form of the formless, the spirit of the spiritless. Judeo-Christian beliefs talk about the integration of good and evil within the selves. And to my delight, these are no longer ideas that are quite so fringe in management today. Roger Martin, who's the dean of University of Toronto's Rotman Business School, would suggest that our greatest leaders are the ones that can embed integrative thinking. And business gurus, Jim Collins and Jerry Porras, would suggest that our most visionary leaders are the ones that can rid themselves of the shackles of the tyranny of the or in order to embrace the genius of the and. You see, it may be that once it was helpful to have either or thinking when our world was more stable, was more simple, was more local. But we now live in a world that's much more complex, global, and dynamic. And in this world, if we are to sustain our world, if we're truly going to change our world, we have to be able to embrace the power of paradox. Thank you.